I didn't run from that wedding because I stopped loving anyone. I ran because I finally understood what I was being sold for. And when I climbed into the back of a stranger's limousine to disappear, I didn't know I'd crawled straight into the hands of the one man my father had spent 15 years trying to destroy. Damiano Vitale didn't save me. Not at first. He weighed me. And it took me far too long to realize that being weighed by a man like that could feel almost the same as being wanted. The dress was too tight across the ribs, and I told myself that was the reason I couldn't breathe. Chin up, Isabel. My stepmother, Carol, pinned the last curl into place with a force that made my scalp sting. Your father has men from 3 states in that ballroom. Don't give them a reason to whisper. I looked at myself in the mirror because that's what a bride is supposed to do. The woman looking back had my mother's cheekbones and none of her warmth. My mother had been dead 11 years, and somehow I still measured every mirror against the memory of her face in one, laughing at something my father hadn't said. Where's Dante? I asked because it was expected of me to ask. Greeting guests. Where a groom should be. Carol adjusted the veil, her fingers cold through the fabric. You should be grateful. Dante Cross could have any woman in Chicago. Your father secured you a good match. Good match. That was the phrase they used for it. Not a marriage. A match. The way you describe 2 chemicals that wouldn't explode if you were careful enough pouring them together. I knew what the match was actually for. I'd known since I was 16 and overheard my father, Salvatore Serrano, on the phone with a man whose name he never said twice in the same room. The Cross family controlled the ports. My father controlled what moved through them without questions. A marriage between his daughter and their son would weld the 2 operations into something no rival, and no federal task force, could easily pry apart. I was the weld. Through the half-open door of the bridal suite, I heard the string quartet warming up, heard my father's laugh, the big, performative one he saved for men he wanted something from. I heard glasses clinking. I heard, underneath all of it, the low, steady sound of my own heartbeat going somewhere my body hadn't agreed to yet. I need air, I said. Carol's eyes narrowed. You need to walk down an aisle in 11 minutes. I need air, Carol. Or I'm going to be sick on the dress, and then you'll have a real problem. That worked. It always worked, threatening the dress instead of threatening the wedding. She waved a hand toward the private hallway that led to the hotel's side garden and told me to be quick, to breathe through my nose, to not, for God's sake, smudge anything. I walked out into November air so cold it felt like a slap of clarity. And I kept walking. I want to tell you it was a plan. It wasn't. It was the oldest, most animal thing a body can do, which is move away from the thing that is going to hurt it. I went past the topiary, past the valet stand where nobody was looking because the wedding party owned the whole block for the night, past the low iron gate that led to the service alley behind the hotel. The heels went first. I stepped wrong on the cobblestone and my ankle screamed, and I simply took the shoes off and left them where they fell, 2 small ivory ghosts in the dark. Then I ran. The dress was 11 pounds of French lace, and it dragged through puddles like it was trying to anchor me back to the life I was supposed to be living in 11 minutes. Somewhere behind me I heard Dante's voice. Not panicked, not even particularly urgent, more annoyed, the way you'd sound if a delivery was late. Isabel, this isn't funny. It wasn't supposed to be funny. It was supposed to be the last honest thing I ever did in that family, and I intended to do it thoroughly. I cut down a side street I half recognized from childhood, back when my mother used to take me to a bakery 2 blocks from here before she got sick, before the illness that everyone in my family still refused to name directly, as if cancer might hear its own diagnosis and come back for someone else. The street was darker than I remembered, lined with black cars parked nose to tail for some other event at some other hotel, engines off, drivers gone or dozing. And that's when I saw it. Long matte black, no plates visible from this angle, a small emblem on the rear door I couldn't make out in the dark except that it caught the streetlight like old silver, a wolf's head inside a broken circle. I'd seen that emblem exactly once before, on a folder my father had locked in his desk and forgotten to lock the desk itself. Vitale. The name he said the way other men said cancer. The name that made my father drink an extra 2 fingers of scotch any night it came up in conversation, which was rare, Because my father did not like admitting there was a man in this city he was afraid of. The car's door handle gave when I pulled it. I don't remember deciding to get in. I remember the smell first. Cedar, gun oil under something antiseptic, a coat that had been dry cleaned too recently. And then I remember being on the floor between the seats with my dress bunched under me like a discarded parachute, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to since my mother's funeral that whoever this car belonged to was still inside whatever building it was parked outside of. I heard Dante's voice pass on the street above, then fade. I heard my own pulse in my ears louder than either. I don't know how long I crouched there. Long enough that my knees went numb. Long enough that I started composing in my head the version of tonight I'd tell people someday. I hid in a car I don't even know whose. I was that desperate, before I understood that there might not be a someday where that story was funny. The front door opened. A man's voice, low, unbothered. "Evening, sir." Then the back door. A gust of cold air, the rustle of an expensive coat. The door shutting with a sound too soft for how solid it clearly was. The car pulled away from the curb. I held my breath so hard my vision blurred at the edges. We drove for maybe 90 seconds before the voice above me said, without any change in tone, without a shred of surprise in it, "You have exactly one more block to decide whether you're going to keep pretending to be a dropped umbrella, or whether you're going to sit up and tell me why my car smells like a wedding." I didn't move. "I know every stitch of lace in this city cost somebody a small fortune," he said. "Yours is currently soaking my floor mat. Sit up." Sat up. The man across from me was younger than I expected. Mid-30s, maybe, dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been built specifically to say no to people. His suit was black, no tie. The top button of his shirt undone in a way that read less like carelessness and more like a decision. He looked at me the way you'd look at a report that had come back with an unexpected number on it. Not alarmed, just recalculating. "Isabel Serrano," he said. It wasn't a question, and that terrified me more than if he'd shouted it. "You know my name. I know your father's name. Yours came free with it." He studied my face, the ruined hem of my dress, the bare feet tucked beneath me. "You're supposed to be getting married right now." "I know. To Dante Cross." "I know that too." Something moved at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one passing through and deciding not to stay. "So which is it? You got cold feet or you got smart?" I looked at him. Really looked, the way you look at someone when you've stopped having the energy to perform for them, and said the truest thing I'd said all night. "Does it matter? Either way, I'm not going back." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city blurred past in ribbons of orange streetlight and black glass. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped into something colder, more deliberate, and it was that coldness, not any threat, not any raised hand, that made the hair rise on my arms. "You have no idea whose car you climbed into, do you?" "I have some idea." "Then you know your father would set half this city on fire to get you back tonight. And you know," he said, leaning forward slightly, elbows on his knees, dark eyes never leaving mine, "that I am, at this exact moment, the only man in Chicago your father would burn that fire for without hesitation." I swallowed. "Are you going to give me back to him?" He didn't answer right away. He reached up and rapped 2 knuckles once against the partition glass. "Marco. The safe house on Aldine. Not the penthouse." "Copy, boss." Then he settled back into his seat, folded his hands, and looked at me with an expression I would spend the next several weeks trying and failing to read. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight, Miss Serrano, you're worth considerably more to me alive, frightened, and grateful than you are handed back in a box with a bow on it. What I decide to do with you after that, we'll discuss once I understand exactly how much your father is going to be willing to pay to get you back." The car kept moving. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally broke against the windows, and I sat there in 11 pounds of ruined lace, understanding with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that I had not escaped anything. I had simply traded one man who owned me for another who hadn't decided yet whether he wanted to. The safe house on Aldine Avenue didn't look like anything. That was, I would learn, the entire point of it. From the outside it was a narrow 3-story brownstone wedged between 2 identical brownstones, The kind of building you'd walk past 100 times without your eye catching on it once. No gate. No guards visible on the street. Just a black door with a brass number that had gone green at the edges, and curtains drawn in every window facing the road. Damiano didn't get out first to open my door. He simply stepped out, straightened his jacket, and waited on the sidewalk with the patience of a man who had never once in his life been in a hurry, watching me climb out on my own, barefoot, dragging 11 pounds of ruined lace across wet pavement, without offering a hand. "You're not going to help me," I said. Came out flatter than I meant it to. "You didn't ask for help. You asked to not go back to your father. Those are different services, and I only agreed to one of them tonight." Inside, the house was warmer than I expected, and older. Dark wood floors, a narrow staircase, a smell of wood smoke and something floral I couldn't place. A woman appeared from the back before Damiano had even shut the door, silver-haired, maybe 60, wiping her hands on an apron that had definitely never touched flour in this house's actual kitchen. "Madonna," she said, looking me over. The dress, the bare feet, the mascara that had given up somewhere around the third block. She didn't ask a single question. She just turned to Damiano. "Which room?" "Second floor. Whatever fits her." "Renata, no calls out of this house tonight. Not even to her own sister until I say otherwise." "Yes, sir." I opened my mouth to object to being discussed like a piece of furniture being relocated, and then closed it again because I understood, somewhere under the exhaustion, that objecting was a currency I didn't have enough of yet to spend on something this small. Renata led me up the stairs. The room she gave me was plain. A narrow bed, a lamp, a wardrobe that smelled of cedar, but clean and warm, and it had a lock on the inside of the door, which I noted the way you note anything when you've spent the last hour learning to catalog exits. "There's a robe in the wardrobe," Renata said. "Bath's down the hall. I'll bring you something to eat. You're not going to want the dress anymore, I expect." "No," I said. "I don't think I ever wanted it." She almost smiled at that. The first almost smile I'd gotten from anyone in this house, and left without another word. I stood in front of the small mirror over the dresser for a long time before I made myself look at it. The woman in the glass had smudged eyeliner tracking down to her jaw, hair that had taken 4 hours to pin now hanging in wet ropes, and a look in her eyes I didn't recognize from any version of myself I'd been allowed to be in the Serrano house. Not fear exactly. Something colder and steadier than fear. Something that had been waiting a long time for a door to open. I took the dress off like I was peeling off a second skin. Dinner, when Renata brought it, was simple. Bread, a bowl of soup with too much pepper in it, a glass of red wine I didn't touch. I ate on the edge of the bed in a borrowed robe 2 sizes too big, and I was halfway through the bread when I heard footsteps on the stairs that weren't Renata's. Heavier, unhurried, the kind of walk that didn't quicken for anyone. Damiano didn't knock. He opened the door, looked at the tray, looked at me, and leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed like a man settling in for a conversation he'd already scripted in his head. "Your father called Marco's cell 40 minutes ago," he said. "He doesn't know it's Marco's. He thinks it belongs to a wedding planner who owes him a favor." I set the bread down. "What did he say?" "He offered $200,000 for information leading to your return. To a wedding planner. That should tell you something about how much he thinks you're worth to him, versus how much he's willing to admit to anyone else that you're missing." The bread turned to paste in my mouth. "And what do you think I'm worth?" Damiano tilted his head slightly, studying me the way he had in the car. Cataloging, not admiring. "That depends entirely on what you know." "Excuse me. You grew up in that house for 24 years, Isabel. You sat at that table. You answered that phone sometimes, I'd guess, when your father was in the shower and a call came through he wasn't supposed to miss. You are, whether you've ever thought about it this way or not, a woman who has spent 2 decades absorbing information she was never meant to keep." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "You didn't take me in out of chivalry." "I took you in," he said, "because a Serrano bride running loose through my city on the night of her own wedding is either the best luck I've had in 3 years, or the most elaborate trap your father has ever set. I intend to find out which before I decide what happens to you next." "That's not an answer to what I asked." No, he agreed. It isn't. He straightened off the doorframe, and for a moment I thought he was going to leave it there, cold and unfinished, the way he seemed to leave every sentence that mattered. Instead he crossed the room, not close, not threatening, just close enough that the air changed temperature, and looked down at the tray Renata had brought. You didn't touch the wine. I don't like drinking things I didn't watch being poured. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite approval, but close enough to it that I filed the reaction away the way I imagined he was filing away everything about me. Smart, he said. Your father's men have done worse for less reason. Is that a threat? It's an observation. I don't waste threats on people who haven't done anything to earn one yet. He turned toward the door, then paused, one hand on the frame, and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't place. Not warmth, not quite, but something adjacent to it, like warmth's more careful older brother. Get some sleep, Isabel. Tomorrow I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about your father's shipments through the northerly terminal. And I'll know if you're lying. He left. The door didn't lock from the outside. I checked twice, my hand shaking slightly on the old brass knob. But I understood, lying in that narrow bed with the lamp still on, staring at a ceiling that wasn't mine in a house that wasn't mine, that the absence of a lock wasn't mercy. It was confidence. He didn't think I had anywhere left to run. He was right. I woke before dawn to voices downstairs. Low, urgent, a texture to them I hadn't heard the night before. I sat up in the dark, the borrowed robe pooling around me, and listened the way I'd learned to listen in my father's house. Not to the words, but to the shape of the conversation, the places where voices rose and where they cut themselves off. I heard Marco's voice first, tight in a way it hadn't been in the car. 3 cars, boss, moving slow past the Aldine block twice in the last hour. Could be nothing. It's not nothing, Damiano said. His voice had none of the unhurried calm from the night before. Salvatore doesn't send cars past a street twice unless he already knows what's on it. My stomach dropped. I was out of bed and at the door before I decided to move, my ear against the old wood, my heart going too hard against my ribs. You think she called someone, Marco said. It wasn't quite a question. I think, Damiano said, and there was something in his voice now that I hadn't heard yet. Not anger, colder than anger. That I told Renata no calls out of this house, and I intend to find out in the next 5 minutes whether that instruction was followed. I opened the door before he could come up the stairs to test the theory himself. Damiano was already 3 steps up when I appeared at the top of the landing, and he stopped, looking up at me with an expression I would come to recognize as the particular stillness he wore right before deciding something irreversible about a person. I didn't call anyone, I said. I don't have a phone. You watched Marco take everything out of my clutch before we even got in the car. Someone knows you're here. Or someone's guessing. My father knows every safe house in this city that's ever been rumored to belong to you, Damiano. He spent 15 years cataloging your operation the way you're apparently now cataloging me. This doesn't have to be about me giving anything away. It could just be about him being thorough. He studied me for a long moment, and I watched him do the math. Actually watched it, the way you'd watch someone solve an equation on a chalkboard, weighing the version of events where I was exactly what I claimed to be against the version where I was a very well-placed problem his enemy had handed him wrapped in white lace. Get dressed, he said finally. Whatever Renata gave you. We're not staying to find out which version of this is true. Where are we going? Somewhere smaller. Somewhere your father doesn't know exists, because it wasn't mine 3 years ago. It belonged to a man who made the mistake of thinking he could skim from my shipments without me noticing. A pause, and something almost like dark humor crossed his face. He doesn't need it anymore. I didn't ask what had happened to that man. I was beginning to understand that in this house, in this life I'd apparently ended up borrowing for however long it would last. Some questions were more dangerous to have answered than to leave alone. 10 minutes later I was in the back of a different car. Smaller, dark, the leather cold against skin I hadn't fully warmed since the fountain of rain the night before, with Damiano beside me instead of across from me for the first time, close enough that I could feel the tension radiating off him like heat off asphalt. If this is a trap, he said quietly, not looking at me, eyes on the street sliding past the tinted window, I want you to understand something before we find out. What's that? He turned his head then, and in the dim light his eyes were darker than I remembered and steadier. I don't hand back what's mine. Not to your father. Not to anyone. Whatever you are to me by the end of today. Hostage, informant, liability. You stay mine until I decide otherwise. That's not a comfort, Isabel. It's a warning. Make sure you understand the difference before you decide how grateful to be. Outside, the city was just beginning to gray into morning, and somewhere behind us, 3 black cars were still circling a brownstone that no longer held anything worth finding. The second safe house wasn't a house at all. It was the top 2 floors of what had once been a textile warehouse near the river, the brick walls still stamped with a company name that had gone out of business before I was born. Inside, someone had done careful, expensive work to make it livable. Exposed beams, a kitchen with better appliances than the one I'd grown up with, floor-to-ceiling windows blacked out with a film that let light in but kept anyone outside from seeing more than a smear of shadow. Damiano walked through it like a man checking a wound he already knew the shape of. He touched nothing. He simply moved room to room, taking inventory, while Marco stood at the door with his hand resting near his jacket in a way I understood now wasn't casual at all. Nobody followed, Marco said finally, coming back from the stairwell. I know, Damiano said. I watched the whole way. He turned to me then, and for the first time since the limousine, he looked genuinely tired. Not soft, not sympathetic, just human in a way that made me realize how carefully he'd been performing certainty since the moment I'd climbed onto his floor mat. Sit, he said, nodding toward a leather chair near the windows. We're going to have the conversation I promised you last night, and I'd like it to happen before I've had less sleep than I have right now, because I find I have less patience for lies when I'm tired. He didn't sit across from me the way he had in the car. He pulled a second chair around so it faced mine directly, close enough that our knees nearly touched, and I understood this was deliberate. Not intimacy, but the removal of distance as a kind of pressure, the same way an interrogator might lean in rather than lean back. The northerly terminal, he said. Tell me what you know. I know it exists. I know my father owns a stake in it through 3 shell companies. And I know he doesn't like saying its name out loud on the phone. That's public record, Isabel. A determined intern could find that in an afternoon. I need what an intern can't find. I thought of my father's office, the smell of cedar and cigar smoke, the ledger he kept in a drawer that didn't lock because he never imagined I'd be brave enough, or bored enough, or lonely enough to go looking through it on the nights. He left me alone in that house with nothing but Carol's cold civility for company. There's a shipment schedule, I said slowly. He keeps it on paper, not digital, because he doesn't trust anything digital since the FBI subpoenaed his email in 2019. I've seen it. I don't have it memorized, but I know the pattern. The ships that actually carry what the manifest says, and the ones that don't. Something shifted in Damiano's expression. Not excitement, nothing so unguarded as that, but a kind of focused stillness. The look of a man realizing the numbers on the page in front of him were better than he'd let himself hope. How do you know the difference? Because the ones that don't match get a second inspection scheduled by a customs official my father pays directly. And he always mentions the official's daughter's name when he talks about it on the phone. Like a code. Like reminding himself who he's protecting and who he's paying. I met his eyes. Her name is Sophia. She's 12. She has a violin recital every spring that my father sends flowers to. And I used to think that was almost sweet, before I understood what it meant that a girl's violin recital was collateral in a shipping fraud. Damiano didn't say anything for a long moment. When he did, his voice had lost some of its edge. You've thought about this before. About what it means. I've had 11 years to think about what it means, Damiano. I was 17 the first time I understood what my father actually did for a living, and 24 the first time someone asked me to marry into more of it. You're not the first man to look at me and see a ledger instead of a person. You're just the first one who's said it out loud. I watched that land somewhere I hadn't expected it to. A small, involuntary tightening at the corner of his jaw, gone almost as fast as it appeared. He looked away first, out toward the blacked-out windows, and for a moment the silence in the room had a different texture than the calculating one we'd been sitting in. "I'm not apologizing for the ledger," he said finally. "I can't afford to be a man who apologizes for it. Every time I have been in this line of work, it's cost me something I couldn't get back. I didn't ask you to apologize. I asked you to notice. I noticed the moment you turned down the wine." That surprised a short, humorless laugh out of me. "That's a low bar. It's the only bar that's ever mattered in my house. Everyone who's tried to destroy me started by being careless with small things. A drink they didn't watch poured, a door they didn't check was locked, a name they said too many times on an unsecured line. You noticed the wine in a house you'd been in for 11 minutes, on the worst night of your life, wearing another woman's robe." He looked back at me, and there was something almost like respect threaded through the assessment in his eyes. "That's not a low bar, Isabel. That's the only bar." I didn't know what to do with that, so I said nothing, and for a while neither did he, and the warehouse settled around us with the particular quiet of a building that had learned, over decades, to keep other people's secrets. Renata, I learned later that she moved between properties depending on which one Damiano was using, a fact that told me more about her position in his world than anything she ever said directly. Arrived an hour later with groceries and a folder that she handed to Damiano without a word, the way you'd hand someone a verdict. He read it standing at the kitchen island, and I watched his face do the thing it seemed to do whenever something mattered more than he wanted to admit. It went very still, very controlled, a stillness that was its own kind of tell if you'd spent as many years as I had learning to read men who'd trained themselves not to be readable. "Your father's raised the offer," he said, not looking up. 200,000 for information. 500,000 for you, delivered unharmed. No questions asked about where you were found. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something colder. The particular grief of watching your own father set a price on you like you were livestock, and feeling almost nothing at all because some part of you had known your whole life this was coming. 500,000, I repeated. That's less than Dante's family was going to get from the merger. That's not the interesting number. Damiano finally looked up. The interesting number is that he's not offering it to me. He knows better than to think I'd take it. He's offering it through 3 separate intermediaries to men in my organization directly. He's not trying to buy you back, Isabel. He's trying to find out if anyone under me is disloyal enough to sell you without my permission. The floor seemed to tilt slightly. You think someone here would? I think your father is a patient man who has spent 15 years building a network of people he pays to be patient with him. I would be a fool to assume that network stops at the edge of my own house. He set the folder down. Which means, effective immediately, you don't leave this floor. Not the stairwell, not the roof access. Not even the hallway outside this door unless Marco or I are with you. You're locking me in. I'm keeping you alive. Those aren't as different as you'd like them to sound. He crossed the space between us again, that same deliberate closing of distance, and this time when he stopped, it was close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to hold his eyes. No, he agreed quietly. They're not. I won't pretend otherwise to make you feel better about it. But I'd rather you resent me alive in this building than grieve for you in a box your father sends back as a message. His voice dropped lower, rougher at the edges in a way I hadn't heard from him yet. And I find, somewhat to my own inconvenience, that I would grieve. I didn't have an answer for that. Neither, it seemed, did he. He looked almost surprised at his own sentence, like a man who'd let something slip past a checkpoint he usually guarded better than that. He stepped back first. Get some rest, he said. His voice restored to its usual controlled register, as if the last 10 seconds hadn't happened. Tomorrow I need the shipment pattern. All of it as much as you remember. And Isabel. What? Thank you. For the truth about the wine. About Sophia. About all of it. A pause, his eyes unreadable again. I don't say that often. Don't expect it to become a habit. He left before I could decide whether that was a joke. That night I dreamed about the bakery my mother used to take me to. The one 2 blocks from the hotel where I was supposed to get married. And in the dream she was alive and the bread was warm and neither of us knew yet what the Serrano name was going to cost me. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of a raised voice downstairs. Not Damiano's, not Marco's, someone new. And lay very still in the dark, listening to the shape of it the way I'd been trained to since childhood. Told you she's not a bargaining chip, she's a liability. And every hour she's under this roof is an hour Serrano has a reason to. That's not your call to make. Damiano's voice, quiet, absolutely final. It hasn't been your call since the moment I brought her through that door. With respect, boss, you've known her for 1 day. With respect, Damiano said, in a tone that made it clear the phrase was a courtesy and nothing more. I've known men for 10 years I trust less than I've trusted her for 1 day. That should tell you something about the men you're comparing her to. Or it should tell you something about yourself. I haven't decided which yet. Silence. Then footsteps, retreating. A door somewhere below closing harder than it needed to. I lay in the dark for a long time afterward, staring at the ceiling of a warehouse that had once made textiles and now made secrets, and thought about the fact that a man who had told me outright, without softening it once, that I was worth exactly as much to him as my usefulness allowed. That same man had just defended me to his own people in a voice that hadn't sounded like calculation at all. It sounded, if I let myself think about it too long, like something closer to the thing I'd spent my whole life being told men like him weren't capable of feeling. I told myself not to be foolish enough to hope it was. I fell asleep anyway, hoping. His name was Enzo Ricci, and I learned it the way I learned most things in that house, by listening through walls that weren't built to keep secrets from me, only from people my father might have sent. Renata said it first, almost carelessly, setting down a breakfast tray the morning after the argument I'd overheard. Enzo's been with the family since before Damiano took over from his uncle. Older than Marco. More senior in the ways that matter to men like that. She said it without inflection, but I'd spent my whole life learning to hear the things women like Renata didn't say directly, and what she didn't say was, "Watch him. He doesn't like me," I said. He doesn't like anything he didn't have a hand in deciding. Renata straightened a fold in the blanket that didn't need straightening. That's not the same as him being wrong to worry. I turned that over for the rest of the morning, sitting in the blacked-out light of the warehouse windows with a legal pad Damiano had given me, trying to reconstruct my father's shipment schedule from memory. The numbers came slower than I wanted them to. Dates blurring. Names of ships I'd only half-registered years ago while pretending to read a magazine in the corner of my father's office. But patterns held better than facts. I remembered the rhythm of it, even where the specifics slipped. 2 clean shipments, then one that wasn't, always on a Thursday, always with the same customs official's name attached like a signature. Damiano read what I'd written with a particular stillness I was starting to recognize as his version of excitement. No visible change, just a stillness that went 1 degree deeper than his usual composure. "This is more than I expected," he said. "I told you I'd give you the truth. You told me. Most people say that and mean the version of truth that keeps them safest." He set the pad down. "You gave me the version that could get you killed if your father ever found out how much you remembered. Maybe I've stopped caring what my father finds out. That's a dangerous thing to stop caring about, Isabel." His eyes stayed on mine a beat too long. "Careful who you let hear you say it." I didn't understand what he meant. Not fully, not yet. Until 3 days later, when Enzo Ricci found a reason to be alone with me for the first time. It happened in the stairwell of all places, the one connecting the 2 floors of the warehouse, dim even with the lights on, the kind of space designed by architects a century ago who never imagined anyone would need it to feel safe. I was coming down to find Renata, and Enzo was coming up, and there was a version of that meeting where we simply passed each other with a nod. That wasn't the version I got. "Miss Serrano." He stopped 2 steps below me, close enough that I had to decide whether stepping back would look like fear or simply look sensible. I chose not to move at all. "A word if the boss's new pet has a moment. I'm not anyone's pet." "No." He smiled, and it didn't reach anything above his mouth. "Funny. From where I'm standing, that's exactly what you are. A very expensive, very dangerous pet that Damiano's decided to keep in a cage he built himself. And he's so busy admiring the cage he's forgotten to ask whether the thing inside it bites. If you have a question, Enzo, ask it. I don't have patience for men who circle things instead of saying them. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, that I'd used his name without being introduced, or maybe just surprise that I hadn't flinched. Fine. Here's the question. Your father's put $500,000 on the table for your safe return. No questions asked. That's not pocket change, even for a man like Salvatore Serrano. Which means one of two things is true. Either you're worth that much to him because he actually loves his daughter. The word came out with open contempt. Or you're worth that much because whatever you know is worth considerably more than $500,000 to the people who'd use it against him. I don't think it's the first one. I've met your father. I don't think love is a language he speaks fluently. I said nothing because there was nothing safe to say, and he seemed to take my silence as confirmation of something. So which is it, he pressed. Are you a liability Damiano's keeping out of sentiment, or are you a weapon he hasn't finished loading yet? Because I've watched him make exceptions for people before. It never ends well for the family. It especially never ends well for the exception. Is that a threat? It's a warning, same as the one he gave you, I'd imagine, about the difference between staying alive and staying comfortable. He stepped past me, close enough that his shoulder brushed mine, and paused at the top of the stairs without turning around. He hasn't told you about his sister, has he? My stomach went cold. What sister? Ask him. A dry, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Ask him why a man who's never once in 10 years made an exception for anyone suddenly can't stop making them for you. You might not like the answer. You might understand him a little better than you'd like to, once you hear it. He was gone before I could ask anything else, his footsteps fading down the corridor, and I stood on that stairwell for a long time afterward with my pulse loud in my ears, turning his words over like stones I didn't want to pick up but couldn't stop touching. I didn't ask Damiano that night. I told myself it was because the moment wasn't right, but the truth was simpler and less flattering. I was afraid of what an answer might cost me, the way you're afraid to pull a thread on a sweater you already suspect is unraveling. I asked 3 nights later instead, after Enzo's warning had curdled into something I couldn't set down. We were in the kitchen late, the rest of the house gone quiet in the particular way buildings go quiet when everyone in them is pretending to be asleep. Damiano was pouring 2 glasses of something dark and unlabeled, and he handed me one without asking, which by then had become its own kind of language between us, an assumption of trust neither of us had said out loud. Enzo told me to ask you about your sister, I said. The glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down without drinking, and for a moment the kitchen held a silence so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming somewhere behind him. Enzo talks too much for a man in his position, he said finally. He's not wrong that you're keeping something from me. I'm not obligated to give you my whole history because you're currently sleeping under my roof, Isabel. No, I agreed. You're not. But you asked me to tell you the truth about my father's ledgers, about Sophia, about things that could get me killed if the wrong person heard I'd said them. I did that. I didn't have to. I'd like to think that earns me something. He was quiet for a long moment, turning the glass slowly on the counter, and when he spoke again his voice had lost the guarded edge it usually carried, replaced by something rawer, older. Her name was Carla, he said. My younger sister. She was 19. My uncle, the man who ran this family before me, arranged a marriage for her to settle a debt with the Marchettis. Not unlike the arrangement your father built for you, except Carla didn't have a limousine to climb into. She didn't have anywhere to run. I didn't move. I didn't breathe either, not fully. She died 8 months after the wedding, he said. Officially an accident. Officially she fell. His jaw tightened, the same small, controlled movement I'd seen once before in the warehouse, when I told him he was the first man to say the ledger part out loud. I was in Sicily when it happened, handling something my uncle called urgent. I got back 2 days too late to change anything, and I have spent every year since telling myself that if I'd been faster, if I'd asked more questions, if I'd made a single different decision in the 6 months before that, she'd still be here. Damiano. So when Enzo asks why I've made an exception for you, he said, and his eyes came up to meet mine, dark and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen from him yet. The honest answer is that I didn't decide to. I looked at a woman who ran barefoot through the rain rather than marry a man her father chose for her. And some part of me that I thought I'd buried with my sister decided, without asking my permission, that I was not going to be 2 days late again. The kitchen felt very small and very quiet. I set my glass down because my hand had started very slightly to shake. I'm not her, I said. I don't want to be a chance for you to fix something that already happened. I know that. His voice roughened further. Believe me, Isabel, I know that better than you do. It doesn't change what I said. It only makes it more inconvenient. I don't know which of us moved first. I remember his hand coming up to my jaw, careful, deliberate, the way he did everything, like a man testing whether something would hold weight before he trusted it with his own. I remember the warmth of his palm against skin that had been cold for 3 days straight in a building where the thermostat never seemed to reach the corners. I remember thinking, with a clarity that frightened me more than Enzo's warning had, that I did not want him to stop. The kiss, when it came, wasn't gentle. It wasn't performance either. It was the kiss of two people who had spent 4 days circling something neither of them had permission to want, finally too tired to keep circling. He pulled back first, his forehead resting against mine. His breathing not quite steady. This was not the plan, he said quietly. What was the plan? To use you. To protect the investment your knowledge represented. To hand you back to your father the moment it stopped being useful to keep you. Or to keep you exactly as long as it took to bury him with what you knew. His thumb moved once against my cheekbone. I would like to tell you the plan has changed. I'm not entirely sure yet that it has. I only know that I no longer recognize which version of tonight was the honest one. Before I could answer, a sound cut through the quiet of the house. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong. The particular click of a door downstairs that should have been locked, followed by the low murmur of a voice that wasn't Marco's, wasn't Renata's, wasn't anyone who belonged in that building at that hour. Damiano went still in a way I hadn't seen from him yet. Not the calculating stillness, something sharper, more animal. Stay here, he said, already moving toward the drawer beneath the counter, already coming back with something dark and metal that I didn't let myself look at too closely. Lock this door behind me. Don't open it unless you hear my voice specifically say your name. Damiano. Isabel. His eyes found mine one last time before he reached the door, and in them was the same rawness from a moment ago, threaded now with something colder, harder, already preparing for whatever waited downstairs. Whatever happens in the next 10 minutes, I meant what I said. About not being 2 days late. The door closed behind him. I turned the lock with hands that had stopped shaking and started, instead, to go perfectly, terribly still, and pressed my ear against the wood to listen for a voice that hadn't come yet. I pressed my ear to the door and counted my own heartbeats because counting was the only thing that kept them from climbing into my throat. I heard Marco's voice first, low and controlled, the particular calm of a man with a hand already resting on his weapon. Then a second voice, unfamiliar, and yet not entirely, something in its cadence tugging at a memory I couldn't place until the words themselves caught up to the sound. I'm not armed. I'm not here on your enemy's behalf. I need 10 minutes with Damiano Vitale, and then I'll leave the way I came, and you'll never see me again unless you want to. I knew that voice. It took me a moment longer than it should have, because I had spent 4 days training myself not to think about the life I'd run from, and hearing it here, in a building he shouldn't have known existed, scrambled something in my chest that felt almost like vertigo. And across. I unlocked the door before I'd fully decided to. Some instinct older than caution insisting I needed to see this with my own eyes rather than piece it together through wood and distance. Damiano's head turned sharply at the sound of the lock, a warning already forming on his face, but I was already at the top of the stairs, looking down into the warehouse's main room. Dante looked smaller than I remembered him. Not physically. He was still the broad-shouldered, expensively tailored man I'd been engaged to for 8 months, but smaller in the way people look when the performance they've been running has finally cracked. His tuxedo jacket was gone. His shirt was rumpled, sleeves pushed up, and there was a look on his face I had never once seen in 8 months of stilted dinners and photographed appearances. Exhaustion so complete it had stopped bothering to hide itself. Isabel. His eyes found me at the top of the stairs, and something in his shoulders dropped, relief maybe, or the particular collapse of a man who'd been holding a breath he didn't know he was holding. You're alive. Thank God. Why are you here, Dante? My voice came out steadier than I felt. Because your father is planning to make sure you don't stay that way. The room went very quiet. Marco's hand tightened, almost imperceptibly, near his jacket. Damiano hadn't moved, but something in his stillness had sharpened into the particular focus I'd started to recognize as him deciding, in real time, exactly how dangerous the next 60 seconds were going to be. Explain, Damiano said. 2 syllables, ice cold. The voice of a man who'd learned long ago that threats worked better delivered quietly. Dante's eyes moved between us. Me at the top of the stairs, Damiano near the counter, Marco by the door with his hand still resting on something lethal, and something in his expression shifted, some final calculation completing itself. I never wanted this marriage, he said. I want to be clear about that, in case it matters to anyone in this room. My father wanted the Serrano port steak. I wanted a short, humorless laugh. It doesn't matter what I wanted. Never mattered. But I sat in enough rooms with my father and Salvatore Serrano to hear things I don't think either of them meant for me to fully understand. Get to the part that explains why you're in my warehouse, Damiano said. 2 days ago your father, Dante nodded toward me, met with a man named Cormac Marchetti. I don't know if that name means anything to you. I felt the air in the room change before I understood why. Damiano's jaw tightened, that same small, controlled movement, and beside him Marco went very still in a way that told me the name meant a great deal indeed. It means something to me, Damiano said quietly. Then you already know they don't like each other. What you might not know is that they've apparently decided to like each other enough, temporarily, to solve a shared problem. Dante's eyes came back to me, and there was something almost like pity in them now, an emotion I'd never once seen him direct at me in 8 months of engagement. Your father isn't trying to buy you back anymore, Isabel. Not really. The $500,000 offer is still out there because it needs to be, for appearances, so nobody asks why a father stopped negotiating for his own daughter's safe return. But 2 nights ago he told Marchetti he doesn't need you back alive. He just needs to be certain that whatever you know dies with you, before it reaches anyone who could use it against him. The silence that followed had a texture I could feel against my skin. Marchetti has people inside Vitale's organization, Dante continued, his voice dropping lower, more careful, like a man realizing too late how much danger his own honesty was putting him in. That's the part one actually came here to say. Someone close to you, Mr. Vitale. Someone your father's confident enough in that he made the arrangement without needing to spell out the details twice. I saw it land on Damiano's face before he said a word. Not surprise, something colder and more familiar, an old wound reopening in a shape he already recognized. Enzo, he said. It wasn't a question. Dante's silence was answer enough. What happened next moved faster than I could fully track. Damiano crossed to Marco and said something low and clipped in Italian that made Marco's expression harden into something I hadn't seen from him yet. Not surprise, but a kind of grim confirmation, as if some suspicion he'd been carrying quietly had just been given a name. Marco left the room at a pace just short of running. Dante hadn't moved from where he stood, and when Damiano's attention finally returned to him, it carried a weight that made even Dante, a man who'd grown up adjacent to this world his whole life, visibly brace himself. Why, Damiano said, would the groom drive himself into a rival's warehouse to warn a woman he lost, at considerable risk to his own life, about a plot that doesn't cost him anything to simply let happen? Dante's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. Because I watched Isabel run out of that ballroom in bare feet rather than marry me, and instead of feeling insulted, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in 8 months of pretending this arrangement was fine. Relief. He looked at me, and for the first time in 8 months, I saw something almost human in his face. I didn't want this marriage either, Isabel. I want to be on record saying that, in case it's the last useful thing I ever do. My father wanted the port steak. I wanted out of a life where every decision I've ever made has been made for me by men calculating what I'm worth. I think, in a strange way, watching you run was the first time I'd seen anyone in our world choose anything for themselves. I couldn't let you die for it. That's the whole reason. It's not more complicated than that. I didn't know what to do with the rawness of that, standing at the top of a stairwell in a warehouse that had become the strangest home I'd ever had, so I said the only true thing I had. Thank you. My voice cracked slightly on the second word. For coming. For telling us. Don't thank me yet. Dante's eyes moved back to Damiano, and something in his posture straightened, some old habit of self-preservation reasserting itself. Marchetti's not planning to wait for a convenient moment. He's using tonight, the confusion of you moving her between houses, whatever cover story your organization is running to explain her absence. He thinks tonight is the night nobody's watching closely enough. A sound came from the stairwell behind Marco's usual post, quick, controlled footsteps, and then Marco himself reappeared. His face grim in a way that told me before he spoke that whatever he'd found had confirmed everything Dante had just said. Enzo's gone, Marco said. His car gone. And boss. He hesitated, the way a man hesitates before delivering the piece of news he knows will land hardest. The east stairwell door's been unlocked from the inside. 20 minutes ago, maybe less. Damiano's face didn't change, but something in the room's temperature dropped several degrees, and when he spoke his voice had gone into a register I hadn't heard from him yet. Not the cold calculation, not the raw honesty from the kitchen an hour before, but something underneath both of those, older and more dangerous, the voice, I understood suddenly, of the man who'd once been 2 days too late and had spent every year since promising himself he never would be again. Get her upstairs to the roof access, he said to Marco. Now. And get Mr. Cross somewhere safe until we understand whether he came here alone. I came alone, Dante said. I swear it. You'll forgive me, Damiano said, already moving toward the drawer beneath the counter again, already retrieving the same dark, heavy shape from earlier. If tonight is not the night, I extend trust to a cross on nothing but his word. I grabbed his arm before he could move past me, my fingers closing around his sleeve with a strength that surprised us both. Damiano. He stopped, looked at me, and for just a moment, the coldness dropped away entirely, and what was underneath it was something closer to fear than I'd ever expected to see on that face. I need you upstairs, he said quietly. I need you safe. I cannot do what I'm about to do if I'm also worried about where you are. Then let me help. I know my father's patterns. I might know Marchetti's if you tell me what you know. I am not going to sit in a locked room again and listen through a door while people decide what happens to my life. Something in his expression cracked open. Not weakness, something closer to recognition. A man realizing he'd finally found someone who refused to be handled the way everyone in his world had always been handled. Fine, he said. But you stay behind me. And Isabel. His hand came up briefly to my jaw, the same careful gesture from the kitchen, gone as quickly as it appeared. If I tell you to run, you run. No arguments. Not tonight. I nodded, and downstairs, somewhere in the dark stairwells of a warehouse that had once made textiles and now, apparently, was about to make a battlefield, I heard the first sound of a door being forced that didn't belong to anyone who lived there. The first shot came from below, muffled by 2 floors of brick and old timber, and I felt it more than heard it, a concussion in the air that made the wine glasses on the counter tremble against each other. Down, Damiano said, and his hand closed around my wrist and pulled me behind the kitchen island before I'd finished processing the sound. Marco was already moving. Dante flattened against the wall near the stairwell door with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering, in real time, every choice that had led him to a warehouse full of armed men on the worst night of his life. How many? Damiano asked. His voice pitched low, steady, the same controlled register he used for everything that mattered. 3, maybe 4, coming up the east stairwell, Marco said. Enzo's not with them. Not yet. He will be. Damiano's eyes moved to me, quick, assessing. The roof access. Now. I told you I'm not hiding. I heard you the first time. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to be somewhere I don't have to split my attention keeping you alive. His jaw tightened. There's a difference, and right now it's the only difference that matters. I hated that he was right. I went. The roof access was a narrow door at the end of the hallway, and beyond it a flat expanse of tar and gravel that looked out over the river. The city's lights smeared orange and gold against a sky just beginning to lighten at its edges. Marco came with me, his weapon drawn, positioning himself between me and the stairwell door with the unhurried competence of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. Below us, the warehouse had gone from silence to chaos in the space of perhaps 90 seconds. I heard voices raised in Italian, heard the particular flat crack of gunfire that didn't sound anything like it did in movies. Sharper, uglier, over faster than my mind wanted to process. I pressed myself against the low wall at the roof's edge and tried to remember how to breathe. "He'll be fine," Marco said, not looking at me, his eyes fixed on the door. "He's better at this than almost anyone I've ever worked for." "You don't have to say that to make me feel better." "I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I've watched him walk out of worse than this more times than I can count." A pause, and something in his voice shifted, quieter. "He hasn't looked at anyone the way he looks at you since before I started working for him, Miss Serrano. Whatever happens tonight, I don't think he's planning on losing that easily." I didn't have an answer for that. Below us, the gunfire had stopped, replaced by a silence that felt worse. The kind of silence that could mean anything, that could mean the fight was over, or that could mean it had simply moved somewhere I couldn't hear it. Then footsteps on the stairs. Fast, uneven, and my whole body went rigid until I recognized the rhythm of them. Not Enzo's measured, deliberate walk, but Damiano's, quicker than I'd ever heard it, urgent in a way that told me something had gone wrong even before he came through the door. He wasn't hurt. That was the first thing I registered, a wave of relief so sharp it nearly buckled my knees. But there was blood on his sleeve that wasn't his, and his eyes, when they found mine, carried something I hadn't seen there yet. "Enzo's dead," he said. "Marchetti's men too, all three. But—" He stopped, and I watched him steady himself before continuing, the same discipline I'd seen him apply to every other piece of bad news he'd delivered since the night I climbed into his car. "He wasn't lying about tonight not being the only plan. There's a second team. Marco, get Mr. Cross to the car. We're not staying here." "Where are we going?" "Yes. Somewhere your father genuinely doesn't know exists." Damiano's hand found my face, quick, checking, the same instinct from the kitchen an hour ago, as if some part of him needed to confirm with his own hands that I was still whole. "I should have moved you the moment Dante walked through that door. I miscalculated how much time we had. That won't happen again." "You didn't miscalculate," I said. "You made a choice to let me help instead of locking me away. Those aren't the same thing, and I'd rather you not apologize for the second one." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but close enough to it that I felt it more than saw it, a small crack of warmth in the middle of chaos. "We'll discuss the wisdom of that choice later," he said. "Right now we move." The new location, when we reached it 40 minutes later, was nothing like the warehouse or the brownstone before it. A modest house on a quiet residential street an hour outside the city, the kind of place that belonged to a schoolteacher or an accountant, not a man who controlled half the ports on the eastern seaboard. "This was my sister's," Damiano said when I asked, standing in the doorway of a small kitchen that still had a calendar from 3 years ago pinned to the wall, faded photographs of a young woman with dark hair and Damiano's same steady eyes tucked into the frame's edges. "I bought it for her before the marriage. She never got to live in it. I've kept it since, and no one outside Marco and Renata knows it exists. It seemed tonight like the only place I could be certain your father's money hadn't already reached." I looked at the photographs longer than I meant to. Carla, laughing at something outside the frame, young and unguarded in a way that made the loss of her feel suddenly, sharply real instead of abstract. "I'm sorry," I said, "for asking about her the way I did. I didn't know. You didn't do anything wrong. Enzo weaponized her memory to frighten you. That's not the same as you causing the wound." Damiano's eyes moved to the photographs too, something old and tired passing over his face. I think in some strange way she'd have approved of you. She never had the chance to run. I think she'd have wanted someone to. Dante, sitting at the small kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee Renata had produced from somewhere, cleared his throat carefully. I should go. My presence here puts all of you at more risk than it removes. My father doesn't know I came tonight, and he can't know, or Marchetti will assume I'm the leak instead of whatever's actually left of his own network. You're not going anywhere until we understand exactly how deep this goes, Damiano said, and there was no real warmth in it, but there was, I noticed, no real threat either. Something closer to the wary respect of a man reassessing an enemy who'd just proven himself more complicated than expected. You came here at considerable risk to yourself. I'd like to understand why before I decide whether that risk earns you anything. Dante's eyes came to me, and for a moment the old performance was entirely gone from his face, replaced by something plain and tired and honest. Because somewhere in the last 8 months of pretending I wanted this marriage, I stopped being able to convince even myself. And because when the fire alarm of my own life finally went off, Isabel was the only person in it who had the courage to actually leave the building. A small, humorless laugh. I'd like to think that means something, even if it's too late to mean what it might have once. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and in the silence that followed, Renata appeared in the doorway with a look on her face that told me, before she spoke a word, that the night wasn't finished delivering bad news. There's a call, she said, holding out a phone I didn't recognize. For Isabel. Your father. The kitchen went very quiet. Damiano's hand found the small of my back, steady, grounding, and when he spoke his voice had gone into that cold, careful register I now understood was armor rather than absence of feeling. You don't have to take it, he said. Yes, I said, reaching for the phone anyway, my hand steadier than I expected it to be. I do. I put the phone to my ear the way you'd touch something you already knew would burn you. Isabel. My father's voice came through steady, almost warm, the voice he used at dinner parties, the voice that had fooled federal agents and business partners alike for 30 years. You've had your adventure. It's time to come home. I'm not coming home. You're standing in a house that belongs to a man who has spent 15 years trying to bury me, and you think that's safer than your own family? A pause, and something colder slid beneath the warmth. Do you know what he is, Isabel? Do you understand what you've made yourself part of? I understand exactly what he is. My eyes found Damiano across the kitchen, his face unreadable, his hand still resting at the small of my back like an anchor. I also understand what you are, which is a man who put a price on his own daughter and shopped it to a rival family rather than admit he'd rather see me dead than free. The silence on the line had weight. You don't know what you're talking about. Cormac Marchetti, I said. 2 nights ago. You told him you didn't need me back alive. You just needed to be certain whatever I know dies with me. I let that sit, let him hear the shake in my voice and understand it wasn't fear anymore. Hadn't been fear for several breaths now. Dante told us everything, Dad. He drove himself into enemy territory at considerable risk to tell us, which is more than you've ever done for me in 24 years. The silence stretched longer this time, and when my father spoke again, the warmth was gone entirely, replaced by something flatter and far more honest. You were always going to cost me something, Isabel. The only question was ever whether you'd cost me a merger or cost me everything I've built. I made my choice. I'd make it again. Then we understand each other perfectly, I said. Because I've made mine too. I know the northerly terminal shipment pattern. I know the customs official's name and his daughter's. And I know exactly which Thursdays your clean manifests aren't clean at all. I gave all of it to Damiano Vitale 4 days ago, and he has done nothing with it yet. That's not mercy, Dad. That's leverage he hasn't decided how to spend. If anything happens to me, anything, an accident, a fire, a fall down a flight of stairs the way Carla Vitale fell down hers, every federal agent in the state is going to have more than enough to bury you for the rest of whatever life you have left. I'm not your liability anymore. I'm your insurance policy, and I'd start being very careful about how you treat the thing keeping you out of prison. I hung up before he could answer. My hand was shaking by the time I set the phone down on the counter, but underneath the shaking was something I hadn't felt in 24 years of being my father's daughter. The clean, cold relief of finally having said the true thing out loud, to the one person who'd spent my whole life making sure I never could. The kitchen was silent. Renata had quietly withdrawn to the hallway. Dante stared into his coffee like it might offer him an escape route. And Damiano was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before, not the careful assessment from the limousine, not the raw honesty from the first kitchen, something new entirely, something that looked almost like awe. "You threatened your own father with federal prosecution," he said slowly, "using information you gave to a man you'd known for 4 days, on the theory that he hadn't used it yet purely out of restraint. Was I wrong?" "No." A ghost of something that might have been pride crossed his face. "You weren't wrong. I hadn't used it yet because I was waiting to see whether you'd ever trust me enough to let me use it on your behalf instead of simply extracting it from you. I think you just answered that question rather more thoroughly than I expected." The weeks that followed didn't move the way I expected them to. There was no single dramatic ending, no clean moment where the danger simply stopped. Only a slow, grinding unwinding of one crisis into the next, smaller one, the way a fire doesn't go out all at once but burns down through its own fuel until there's nothing left to feed it. Marchetti, it turned out, hadn't survived the warehouse either. Marco confirmed it 2 days later, delivered in the same flat, professional tone he used for everything, and I understood without being told that this piece of information wasn't meant to comfort me so much as to close a door that had needed closing. Whatever alliance my father had built with him died in that stairwell, along with the men he'd sent to enforce it. My father, for his part, went quiet in the specific way powerful men go quiet when they've realized the ground beneath them has shifted, and any sudden movement will only make it worse. Renzo. No, not Renzo, I was thinking of the wrong story, the wrong name, a habit I couldn't quite shake from all the versions of this life I'd imagined before living it. Damiano's own lawyer, a careful gray-suited man named Alessi, spent 2 weeks quietly assembling a case file built from everything I remembered about the northerly terminal, ready to be delivered to exactly the right federal contact the moment my father did anything that looked like retaliation. He never did. I don't know if that was wisdom or simple exhaustion. I stopped needing to know. Dante disappeared from the story almost as quietly as he'd entered it. Not dead, not punished, simply gone, back to whatever life he could salvage from a family whose merger had collapsed along with a marriage meant to seal it. He called me once, months later, to say he'd broken from his father's business entirely, moved to Denver, was doing something unglamorous and legal with his hands for the first time in his adult life. I was glad for him in a way I hadn't expected to be. The particular gladness reserved for people who'd been trapped in the same cage as you and had finally, somehow, found their own door out. And Damiano stopped calling me an investment somewhere in the 3rd week, though neither of us marked the exact moment it happened. It simply stopped being said, the way a habit fades when it's no longer true. He brought me back to the house on Aldine once the danger had thinned enough to make it safe, and I found, standing in the same room where I'd first understood how carefully he calculated everything, that the calculation had quietly become something else. Not absence of strategy. Just room, finally, for something that wasn't strategy at all. "I owe you an apology," he said one evening, standing at the window of that narrow brownstone with the curtains open for the first time since I'd arrived, the city's ordinary evening light falling across a floor that no longer felt like a cage. "For what?" "For the first night. Car. I told you that you were worth more to me alive, frightened, and grateful than handed back in a box. I meant it when I said it. I want you to know I no longer mean it, and I want you to understand the difference matters to me more than almost anything I've said since." I crossed the room and took his hand, the same hand that had reached for a weapon 100 times in the weeks I'd known him, and found, for the first time, that it simply felt like a hand. Warm, steady, capable of gentleness he'd spent years convincing himself he couldn't afford. "I know the difference," I said. "I think I've known it for a while." "How long?" "Since the wine," I said, and felt him laugh, quiet and real, against the top of my head. "You never did make me drink it that first night. You just watched me not want to, And you decided that told you something worth knowing. I think that was the first honest thing either of us did. Outside, the city moved on the way cities do, indifferent to the particular war that had nearly cost both of us everything. And somewhere across that same skyline my father sat in a house that no longer felt as safe as he'd built it to feel, and a rival family's ashes settled into whatever peace violence like that ever settles into. None of it touched the narrow brownstone on Aldine Avenue that evening, its curtains open for the first time in months, letting in light instead of keeping it out. I had run from one man's plan for my life directly into another man's calculation, certain, that first rain-soaked night, that I'd simply traded one kind of ownership for a more dangerous version of the same thing. I understood now, standing in that window with his hand in mine, that I hadn't been wrong to be afraid of that trade. I had simply been wrong about which man would be the one, in the end, to set me free instead of keeping me.